Well, hello friends, Marcus D coming at you all with a brand new video I'm producing for the Great Questions group. And this is actually, folks, an introductory video to a brand new series that I'm producing on science, which has been a major component of my Great Questions quest. Indicated that in the last video that I would be doing that. And this is kind of an introductory video to this new series, kind of setting the stage for what we're going to be talking about a little bit and going over some thoughts that were significant to me on this journey. And again, let me just remind you that this is basically a recount of things that I was interested in, that things I studied, I wanted to know. But really, folks, as I've gone along, I've realized that, there are things that, are of interest to any thinking person. And when I'm talking about science here, I'm talking about science as it relates to the study of origins and what type of evidence science itself might be able to give us to explain to us how we got here. And again, why is this important? Well, because Origins deals with the subject of meanings, all right? The great questions, which really are universal questions. Everybody at some point in time asks themselves these questions. How did we get here, all right? And again, there are only really, folks, two explanations for how everything did get here when we look at it in a scientific arena, all right? One is that this is one big random cosmic accident. Time and chance produced everything that we know. All right. And for me, and for a lot of other people as well, if that's where the evidence points or pointed, well, so be it. But really, the outcome or the ultimate result of that reality is no hope. Because this life is it, and we all are terminal, and nobody gets out alive. And as we've talked about in the other, my Great Questions Quest video series, there's a lot of inadequacies in this life. And I certainly could imagine something far better. But again, I didn't want to believe on that, just, kind of pretending, making believe, all right? I wanted it to be based on evidence, all right? And so the other explanation is that this is all a product of design. This is all a product of a vast intelligence, a God who created all of this, which again gives meaning and purpose to this life and also the possibility of a destiny far, far beyond this one, all right? But the question is there any evidence that points in both of these directions? Well, I already in those initial videos, the Great Questions Quest videos series, I already presented a huge piece of scientific evidence talking about how all the matter in the cosmos got together. And that was hugely significant for me because that was a foundational piece. Before I even worried about where anything else came, that kind of gave me some strong evidence as to where all this stuff that's in this universe came from, all right? But now we're going to talk about some of the other things as well. We're going to talk about some of the general ideas, and we're going to get a little more specific about what they are. And again, but I want you to understand, we're going to keep this simple, all right? A lot of folks are not into science. Some of you are. I've always kind of been into it, but I always wanted to keep things simple for myself. And we're going to do that through this as well, because look, folks, I'll tell you this too. You don't have to get that complicated to see how obvious some of this stuff is, all right? And so what I want to do here is, again, we are going to apply science. We're going to look at science as it relates to origins, how we all got here. All right. So first of all, I want to define what science is as far as the way we're going to be referring to it in these videos. All right. And very simply, science simply means knowledge. Folks, it comes from a Latin word, scientia, which simply means knowledge. All right. It's been defined that a knowing, expertness, or experience. I got a definition from Merriam-Webster, which says it is knowledge. And it actually, again, was scientia, all right? It is especially knowledge based on demonstratable and reproducible data, which is actually what science is, the scientific method. It means we study the world that we see, we try to understand it, and then we define it. And that's all science is. And I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. Inherently, intuitively, we are all scientists because we live in the same world. Folks, we all have a brain. We know how this world works. And with that in mind, when we hear evidence that points to reflects the way things really operate in this world, we tend to go, yeah, that makes sense. When we are presented with things that don't seem to make sense in this world, sometimes we're like, wait a minute, what's going on with this? And that's exactly what I did, all right? In other words, I started questioning things. I mentioned this before, all right? I mentioned previously in those other videos that when I started out, I took all the various religions and philosophies that I had studied, including my own, and I set them all off to the side. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to believe in any of these anymore, no matter who had taught them to me, if they could not be validated. Because I wanted to know, is there any evidence backing any of these things up? Well, if I was going to be intellectually honest, I knew I had to do the same thing with some of the scientific theories that I had been taught. All right? And let me just elaborate on that, what I mean by that. There are two different kinds of science that was presented to me. Number one was hard scientific laws that have been proved, laws that were observable, laws that we see in action today in the world in which we know. All right? And they've been defined, and as far as we know, they're inflexible. They operate pretty consistently. They've been proved. All right? Then there were some scientific theories that I had been taught. As a matter of fact, in school, I'd been taught pretty much exclusively. All right. I already alluded to one in those Great Questions Quest videos, but one was the Big Bang Theory. All right. The most common explanation for how this universe and everything in it got here through this cosmic explosion that occurred eons ago, and it expanded and ultimately produced everything we see in the cosmos today. Well, that strained my common sense. All right. I've never seen an explosion in real life produce order. Explosions produce disorder. They destroy things, right? Let me give you the other one, okay, that I had been taught over and over again. And I was very intrigued by this whole concept of evolution. All right. And I had been taught it exclusively. I remember seeing movies. As a matter of fact, if you go back and listen to some of the classic audios I've done, I talk about I was so intrigued as a kid when we lived overseas that we actually went to this place in Tanzania called Olduvai Gorge because I had seen this movie over and over again called The Dawn of Man, which actually referred to that place. And when we were on our safari vacation, our family, 1976, I was 16 years old at the time. My dad and I were mapping out, because it was just our family, it was kind of crazy what we did, going through Kenya and Tanzania, and we'd map out, our little trek from one wildlife lodge to another. And there on this one road in the Serengeti in Tanzania, 10 kilometers off the little road we were going to be driving on, or trail, dirt road, there's Olduvai Gorge. And at 16 years old, I told my dad, I said, we got to go there. And so I stood on the spot where they supposedly found this fossil ape man, okay, Zinjanthropus, East African man. I still remember the scientific name. And I had been taught that over and over again, and I had been taught that it was true, but it still kind of strained my common sense. How did one type of living form turn into another living form? How did life come from non-life? Let me tell you another thing that confused me about that. When I was in high school, there was a theory that was prevalent a long time ago by scientists as to how life arose, and it was called spontaneous generation. The spontaneous production or generation of life from non-life, living things from non-living things. And they believed this happened. As I recall, I remember they used to teach that, or they used to think, they didn't teach this. This had been disproven, the first time I had heard it, I was like in the 6th grade, but it had been disproven way before then. But they believed it for a while because they didn't understand certain things about how life is only produced from life. Okay, interestingly enough. And the two examples were, if you were like in a shed and you had a bunch of dirty rags and maybe some trash in the corner, if you left it there, boom, mice would pop into existence out of that. That was the stuff that mice came from. And they also taught, this is kind of a little bit gross, but if you had rotting meat, the rotting meat, if you left it out for a long time, it would produce maggots, fly larvae. Well, Louis Pasteur, the famous scientist, the bacteriologist who started understanding there was these microscopic organisms, all right, that could cause diseases, and he started, learning a lot about how, washing hands and protecting ourselves from these things. But there were these microscopic organisms, and they started realizing that no, you don't get life from non-life. They taught this in school, all right? Spontaneous generation has been completely refuted, okay, disproven. All right, now, so I'm sitting here thinking, okay, wait a minute. That's been disproven because we now know that the only way, and this is what he did. He took some rotten meat, he left it out, and then he studied it and realized flies came and landed on it and laid their eggs on it, and that's what happened. When he put the rotten meat out, but he covered it, flies couldn't get to it, there were no maggots, all right? Well, now I'm taught the theory of evolution. And again, I want to know how I got here. So, I was taught this is what happened, so I wanted to understand it. I wasn't taught anything else. You know what I was taught? If you wanted to believe that God made everything, that was religion. But if you wanted to be scientific, you had to believe in evolution. That's what I was taught. So I always had this conflict. Well, 6 days God made heaven and earth and everything in it. That's what my religious upbringing was teaching me. And the science side was saying, no, you can believe that. That's a myth. That just makes you feel good. But really, just all this got here by chance. Well, I'm sitting here starting to think about this, okay? And this from a scientific standpoint. Spontaneous generation has been disproven. Okay, well, what is evolution really? Evolution is the production of life from non-life. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. What's going on here? How come that was disproved, but you're telling me this has happened? Well, you need more time. Well, then I started understanding some of the laws of science and that had been proven and that seemed to contradict that as well. As a matter of fact, there's this one law, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about that in the next session. But we've already talked about it. This law of decay that everybody knows about. We may not call it that. We may not understand it's a scientific law, but we live in it. Okay, in this world, everything runs down, everything wears out. Well, they were saying that all you need is enough time and this happens, but that scientific law of decay says the more time that goes by, the more the decay works on whatever's there, the more it breaks it down. So how is this going on? How does this happen? All right. So, this strained my common sense. So really what I began to do, and let me tell you what else started happening to me. I had only been taught that, again, if you're a scientist, you believed in evolution. Well, as I began to explore some of this and really see what was going on, I started getting exposed to different scientists that had different ideas, which I was like, whoa, wait a minute. Well, what I found were there were two great classes or primary explanations for the way everything got here. I kind of already knew that. There was the creation model, plan and purpose, and there was the evolution model, time and chance, all right? And again, I'd been taught this one over here was religion, and this one over here was scientific, all right? But all of a sudden, I started running into, because all of these people over here were highly credentialed and highly educated scientists. So I said, they must know what they're talking about. But then all of a sudden, I started getting exposed to another group of equally highly educated and credentialed scientists that were saying, no, wait a minute, this can't happen. The known laws of science contradict this. And so there was this conflict. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, okay, but it's the first time I'd actually heard that there were scientists. So it wasn't, listen to this, it wasn't really a religion versus science argument. It was science taking a look at the evidence and looking at the science and seeing the implications when we really took the scientific laws and applied it to the evidence that we're seeing, which explanation worked better. Okay? Because, and I'm going to share this with you. Ultimately, they both are beyond the scientific method, because either evolution, which happened in the past, supposedly, or creation, which, okay, for the moment, supposedly happened in the past, we can't study them in the here and now. And to use the scientific method, it has to be repeatable now. All right? So that's what these, both scientists, the evolutionist folks, were admitting that too. No, it happened in the past, doesn't happen now, or it happened so slowly we can't see it. However you want to say it, it can't be tested in the laboratory. Obviously, creation can't be tested in the laboratory, because if God really did make everything, that occurred in the past as well. So, but it was the first time I started hearing, wait a minute, no. It's the science supporting one theory versus the science supporting the other theory. So I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Let me tell you something else that I started realizing as I started getting exposed to this. In the camp, if you will, call it the camp of the evolutionists, there were two primary competing models. I'm like, what? One is it's kind of the theory that Darwin came up with. And let me remind you that Darwin published his book on the origin of species in 1859. That was a long time ago now, okay? There's so much we have learned since then, especially in the last 50, 60, 70 years. The knowledge of the cell, the knowledge of the DNA, the encoding things, the code within all living systems. And we're going to talk some about this, all right? But the Darwinian theory basically is that everything, slow, gradual processes, natural selection, mutations and natural selection, okay? And again, it's interesting. We'll talk a little bit about, that's a later theory of evolution. There was another theory that Darwin had about something called pangenes. He called them inheritance of acquired characteristics. It was the old story about the giraffe. The giraffe, stretched the neck, and every offspring got this. So eventually, the original giraffe had a short neck, and then by stretching the neck to reach the leaves on top, and he believed those could be passed on. That's what Darwin believed. He had something that was called pangenes. Well, he didn't know, okay, because it was 1859. Well, that was totally disproven. So his followers came up with mutations instead. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit more. The bottom line is, look, you don't inherit acquired characteristics, all right? If I lost my arm and I was married and had a child, my child would have an arm, okay? Because it's the reproduction cells that produce the offspring, not what they're called your somatic cells or your body cells, okay? And again, if you right away you go, yeah, okay, that's right. So there was some conflict there that I never knew about. But then now there's this other group of evolutionists that still ardently believe in evolution, but they believe in the technical term is punctuated equilibrium. They don't believe that evolution happened this slow, gradual process. And I'll explain why they don't believe it. It's kind of interesting to watch them argue amongst themselves. That if all of a sudden a creationist, somebody who believes in creation starts, then they immediately, gang up and say, no, you're the unscientific ones. It's really interesting. It's not a question of these guys, creationists or people that believe in creations are unscientific and these guys are scientific. No, it's the science of one model, or the science of the other model, and which one backs it up better. So, again, what these guys believe is that all life just, first of all, popped into existence and then stays steady, different types of species stay steady, and then all of a sudden, because of things that they postulate, okay, which again, when we really look at the hard science, there is none that backs up. It's a faith. Okay? They believe that all of a sudden there's a what they call quantum speciation. In other words, let me give you just a practical example of what they refer to. A dinosaur lays an egg and a bird pops out. Okay? That's what they believe. And so these two camps argue amongst themselves, but then they both gang up and fight the creationists. And look, let me just say this. What I started realizing, wait a minute, what are the implications of both theories? Two great camps, two over here, one over here. What are the implications? All right, there are moral and social and behavioral and accountability implications to the two different models. The evolutionary model is basically atheistic. All right, the creation model basically supports and postulates a creator. Okay, an uncaused first cause that wound all this up. All right, and so, folks, and I quoted Isaac Asimov one time, and about him being president. He's deceased now, president of the American Humanist Association, most prolific science writer ever. Very highly qualified scientist, but was an evolutionist. And then he admittedly said, he goes, emotionally, I'm an atheist. Okay, I do not, and he knew science as well as anybody, but he said, I do not have the evidence to prove that God does not exist. And I heard it said one time, a creationist said that if he doesn't have any evidence, nobody does. And so, there's a spiritual issue. If there really, let's just hypothetically, if there really is a God and there really is the powers of darkness, and as I've talked in other videos, the powers of darkness are trying to blind the minds of those that don't believe or folks that don't want God. All right, don't like that implication. So I'm going to come up with whatever I need to come up with to deny his existence. Well, as we've already talked about, okay, doing that does not make him go away. Doing that does not make him irrelevant if he's really there. All right, and that's what I wanted to know. Okay, I didn't want to pretend that he wasn't there. All right, so what we're going to do in the next video, that I'm going to actually graph these models out. All right, for you. And you're going to find out this is not that complex. Right? You're going to go, wow. All right, because I went, wow. And I've done this for a lot of other people, and they all go, wow. All right, and because it's just clear. It's as clear as day. And I'm going to throw up a couple little simple scientific laws. And all I'm going to do is say, now let's look at this, and you tell me this evidence that I'm presenting, which of these models does it fit better? You make your own decisions. With the evidence that I'm going to present. That's what this whole Great Questions is about. We've all got a brain. We all live in the same world. We all have to take care of our own future. All right. Now I'm going to share one last thing with you, and then we're going to be done. All right. One of the other amazing things that I got exposed to as I started studying this was some of the scientists that did believe in special creation. Had actually produced some publications where they had gone through and found all these different quotes. I've got a little book here called the Quote Book, a little dinosaur on the front. And then I've got another really huge book that their words may be used against them is the title of it. And it's a pretty extensive book. These folks are all quotations. I got my little camera over here, and sometimes I'm looking over here, but I'm trying to look at y'all and read my notes and go through all this. But sometimes I'm making sure I'm still on camera over here. These are all quotes from people that believe in evolution, but they're also honest enough to admit some things. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, as I'm reading some of these things. Like, let me, and all I'm going to do, what I want to do right now is I want to just read you a couple of quotes, 3 of them actually, in these books, all right? The first one is, and again, these are all, eminent scientists, all right, but that have an evolutionary thought process, all right? And so again, just because I started learning that, just because somebody has a PhD or multiple PhDs attached to their name and they've studied all this, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have perfect knowledge either. I've heard PhDs that said, I studied this for years. I did a doctoral program. I'm on the faculty now. And why didn't I ever hear about any of this information? So much of this journey for me, folks, has been about having my eyes opened. I mean, to what I like to call open secrets, stuff that was right there all along. And I just, for whatever the reason, never saw it. And I'm going to tell you what, if you give the Bible credence, if you give what I talked about earlier, God and the powers of darkness credence, there are spiritual forces at work that's what they're trying to do, to blind people. All right. And so anyway, let me read you this. When I talked about just basically two models, here's an evolutionist. Okay, this gentleman's name is Douglas Fatima. He actually wrote a book. Okay, an anti-creationist book called Science on Trial. I've never read it, but even the title, it's not Science on Trial. Okay, it's the evolutionary theory that's on trial. Scientific law has been proven. And again, I've already said it, do the scientific laws that we know of point to an explanation of evolution or an explanation of special creation? That's what we're going to be getting into. But anyway, let me just read this to you because he talks about there's only two models. Creation and evolution between them exhaust the possible explanations for the origin of living things. Organisms either appeared on the earth fully developed or they did not. If they did not, they must have developed from pre-existing species by some process of modification. If they did appear in a fully developed state, they must indeed have been created by some omnipotent intelligence. Okay, so what he's talking about again is it's either or, all right? And there's other quotes that talk about that. But let me give you two others, all right, that are interesting. In case you think, no, this stuff's been proven, all right? This is the stuff that kind of confused me, all right? This is actually an introduction. Darwin's book occasionally gets republished. And the one I'm referring to here, it was republished, this particular version, in 1971. It's basically the same book, but they'll write introductions and they'll put it in the current context and all of this. But this gentleman that's writing this is another gentleman who believes in evolution. He's a highly qualified scientist. He's a fellow of the Royal Society. His name is Matthew L. Harrison. Okay, and it's L. Harrison Matthews. I've got the way they're quoting this. L. Harrison Matthews. I was like, that's not his name. L. Harrison Matthews. And this is from the 1971 edition. Listen to this. This is in the introduction to Darwin's Origin of Species that was republished in 1971. And remember, the original book was produced in 1859, folks. You know, sometimes I quote things in here, it's 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. People go, it's such a long time ago. Darwin did his book in 1859. Okay, so if we're going to talk about things that are a little bit out of date, all right. But anyway, listen to this. This is in the introduction. In accepting evolution as a fact, how many biologists have paused to reflect that science is built upon theories that have been proved by experiment to be correct, or remember that the theory of animal evolution has never been thus proved? The fact of evolution is the backbone of biology, and biology is thus in the peculiar position of being a science founded on an unproved theory. Is it then a science or a faith? Belief in the theory of evolution is thus exactly parallel to belief in special creation. Both are concepts which believers know to be true, but neither up to the present has been capable of proof. Folks, when I started hearing, there's a pile of these quotes. I started hearing quotes like this. I'm like, wait a minute. Okay, wait a minute. This is not. And then all of a sudden I started seeing all these holes. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, okay? We're going to start getting into some of this stuff. We'll talk a little bit about the fossil record. We'll talk a little bit about what it takes to, how could one type of animal turn into another type of animal. We're going to talk about what is often called microevolution, which is just basically adaptation within a kind. How do we have all the varieties of dogs and all the varieties of cats, but we don't have cats turning into dogs, or dogs turning into cats, or dogs turning into deer, or deer turning into bear? There are limits. What causes that? A lot of times they call that microevolution. It's really incorrect. It's adaptation. How is that built into these animals? And can what they talk about, natural selection, survival of the fittest. Is that something that really works? Yes, it is. But the survival of the fittest, that concept does not explain the arrival of the fittest. All right, we're going to talk about that. All these different things. All right, now let me read you one other quote. And again, these books are filled with these quotations. All right, in different aspects of science. But I want to read you one of them. And this is another very eminent evolutionist. Okay. Dr. Colin Patterson, senior paleontologist, he probably former now, I'm sure, senior paleontologist, British Museum of Natural History in London. This was in the keynote address at the American Museums of Natural History, New York City, 5 November 1981. Listen to what this eminent paleontologist said in this address. One of the reasons I started taking this anti-evolutionary view, or let's call it a non-evolutionary view. Now, if any of you have ever been to the American Museum of Natural History, any museum of natural history, can you imagine how this went over? When this guy, this eminent scientist, is addressing all these scientists that were in there that are all, ardent, most of them are all ardent evolutionists. Okay, but I'm like, wait a minute. Started taking this anti-evolutionary, or let's call it a non-evolutionary view, was that last year I suddenly realized that for over 20 years I thought I was working on evolution in some way. One morning I woke up and something had happened in the night, and it struck me that I had been working on this stuff for 20 years and there was not one thing I knew about it. That's quite a shock to learn that one can be so misled for so long. I was just talking about that, okay? Either there was something wrong with me or there was something wrong with evolutionary theory. Naturally, I know there's nothing wrong with me, so for the last few weeks, I've tried putting a simple question to various people and groups of people. The question is, can you tell me anything you know about evolution? Any one thing that is true. I tried that question on the geology staff at the Field Museum of Natural History, and the only answer I got was silence. I tried it on the members of the Evolutionary Morphology Seminar in the University of Chicago, a very prestigious body of evolutionists, and all I got there was silence for a long time. And eventually, listen to this, and eventually one person said, I do know one thing, it ought not to be taught in high school. Okay? I'm like, what? Folks, you know what? This was a while. It still perturbs me when I think about this stuff. So anyway, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, all right? I'm going to be reading you some more quotes as we go through this because I don't want you taking my word for it. But you know what? I want you to take your own word for it, because when I start laying out the evidence and the models and the laws of science and we look at this stuff and I show you stuff that, again, these open secrets or trade secrets, they don't tell us. They didn't tell us. These guys over here, okay, they don't tell us. And I'm like, wait a minute, all right? You're going to be like, duh, this is a no-brainer. And it really is. So the evidence speaks for itself. So, folks, I'm excited about getting into this series with y'all and sharing it with you, because I know it'll be compelling. It'll be compelling, and it begins more and more fully put that picture together of really what this reality is all about. Why are we here? Where do we come from? What is our purpose here? Where are we going? And how is it? How to get there? And ultimately, there are no more important questions than those, and no more important endeavor than finding accurate answers to those questions before we leave this life. Okay? So anyway, until next time, folks, Marcus D signing off. We got a lot more to talk about. God bless you in the meantime. Bye-bye.